He saved an unconscious girl. The CEO never expected this truth. Late at night, the city streets were nearly deserted as Alexander Reed, a powerful yet lonely millionaire CEO, drove home in his sleek black car after a day filled with endless meetings and decisions that weighed heavily on his shoulders, the kind of day that left even the strongest of men craving peace. His hands rested firmly on the wheel, yet his mind drifted, tangled in thoughts of responsibility, loneliness, and the hollowness of a life built on fortune without companionship, his chest heavy with the silence of the night. Neon lights from closed shops flickered across his windshield, casting brief flashes of color into the otherwise dull, monotone world outside. And though the city pulsed faintly in the distance, this quiet street felt isolated, almost forgotten. He loosened his tie with one hand, sighing deeply, his eyes tired, when suddenly something unusual caught his attention near the edge of the sidewalk. At first it looked like a shadow, a lump of discarded clothes perhaps, but as his car rolled closer under the dim glow of a street lamp, the shape became clearer, sharper, and his heart skipped. It wasn't debris, it wasn't trash. It was a person. Instantly alert, Alexander slowed his car, his gaze locked on the fragile figure lying motionless on the cold concrete. His pulse quickened, the sound of his heartbeat louder than the hum of his luxury engine, and without hesitation he pulled over to the curb. Stepping out of the car, the crisp night air wrapped around him, carrying the faint sound of rustling leaves and the distant hum of a city too far away to care. His polished shoes echoed sharply on the pavement as he approached the figure, and in that instant every part of his carefully built, controlled world seemed to blur. Kneeling down, he saw her clearly now. A young girl, unconscious, her body trembling faintly as though the night itself was too heavy for her. Her skin looked pale, her lips dry, her hair disheveled and scattered across her face, and Alexander felt a chill crawl down his spine, a fear that if he had been even minutes later, he might have found her lifeless. Pushing aside the ground dust that clung to his expensive suit, he tapped her shoulder gently, his voice surprisingly soft as he whispered, "Miss, can you hear me?" But no reply came. His concern deepened as he leaned closer, checking for signs of life, and relief flooded through him when he felt a faint, fragile pulse beneath his fingertips. She was alive, but weak, dangerously weak. For a man who prided himself on being composed and unshakable, panic began to creep in, though he fought to keep it hidden. Without wasting another second, he slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her carefully, as though she were made of porcelain that might shatter at the slightest pressure. Her head fell lightly against his chest, her breathing shallow, and he felt the warmth of her body fading quickly, a terrifying reminder that time was slipping away. Holding her tightly, he carried her to his car, lowering her gently onto the leather passenger seat, his luxury vehicle suddenly transformed from a symbol of status into a lifeline for a stranger. Sliding into the driver's seat, Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he turned the key, and the roar of the engine broke the eerie silence of the night. Pressing hard on the accelerator, he sped through the empty streets, every second stretching longer, every streetlight he passed feeling like a countdown. His eyes kept flicking to the fragile figure beside him, each shallow breath she took cutting through the armor he had built around himself. "Hold on. Just hold on," he whispered, barely realizing he was speaking, his voice carrying an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The city lights rushed past in blurs, but for Alexander, the world had narrowed to the rise and fall of her chest. His phone buzzed insistently with calls from business partners, reminders of the empire waiting for him, but he ignored them all. None of it mattered now. Deals could wait, profits could wait. Tonight, only her life mattered. Finally, the hospital's glowing Red Cross sign appeared in the distance, a beacon of salvation in the darkness, and relief surged through him, though he didn't dare slow down until he reached it. Tires screeched as he pulled into the emergency entrance, his heart hammering as he leapt from the car and carried her inside. Nurses rushed toward him, eyes wide at the sight of a millionaire CEO clutching a fragile, unconscious girl in his arms. She collapsed on the street. Please help her. His voice cracked with urgency, startling even himself, for Alexander Reed was a man known for calm, for control, for an icy demeanor. Yet here he was, desperate, vulnerable. The medical team quickly placed her on a stretcher, attaching monitors and checking vitals, while Alexander stood back, his hands clenched, watching helplessly as strangers worked to save the girl he had just met. His heart pounded as the doors to the emergency room swung shut, locking her away from his sight, leaving him stranded in the sterile white hallway, his polished image disheveled, tie loose, suit crumpled. The scent of disinfectant filled his senses, grounding him in a reality where all his money and power meant nothing in this moment. He realized his palms were sweating, something rare, almost foreign, for a man used to commanding boardrooms without flinching. He sank onto a bench, elbows resting on his knees, replaying the memory of lifting her, of her fragile weight in his arms, of the haunting silence of her lips. Why was he the one to find her, he wondered? Why tonight? Why this street? For years, his life had been built on control, precision, order, yet this felt like something ours entirely. Something like fate, pulling him into a story he never expected. Every second dragged as he sat there, listening to the faint echoes of machines beeping behind closed doors, each sound reminding him that her life was fragile, uncertain. He had saved collapsing companies, wrestled through billion-dollar deals, outwitted enemies in the ruthless business world, but none of it compared to this helpless waiting. He leaned back against the cold wall, his jaw tight, a part of him wanting to walk away and pretend it wasn't his concern, but his heart refused to move. For the first time in years, Alexander Reed felt a stirring deep inside him, a pull he couldn't explain. This wasn't just another night, and she wasn't just another stranger. Something had shifted, and though he couldn't name it, he knew this encounter was about to change everything. The cold hallway felt endless as Alexander sat waiting, his eyes fixed on the red light above the emergency room door, every flicker of it feeding the storm inside him. Time crawled at a merciless pace, each tick of the clock on the wall echoing like a hammer against his chest. He rose to his feet, unable to sit still, his polished shoes pacing grooves into the sterile tiles, his mind restless with questions he couldn't silence. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why had fate placed her in his path? The walls offered no answers, only the sharp scent of disinfectant and the low hum of machines working somewhere behind closed doors. Minutes stretched into an hour, and finally the door opened, and a nurse stepped out, her expression professional yet heavy with news. Alexander's eyes locked onto her, his voice breaking through the silence. How is she? The nurse explained gently that the girl had collapsed due to exhaustion and severe hunger, her body pushed beyond its limits by hardship. Alexander's chest tightened, an unfamiliar ache spreading through him as he absorbed her words. Exhaustion and hunger, simple needs, yet unmet in her life, while he lived surrounded by luxury. His mind reeled at the contrast, a bitter taste of guilt rising in his throat. The nurse continued, saying she had no form of identification, no phone, nothing that could explain who she was or where she belonged. Alexander frowned deeply, unsettled by the thought of a life so invisible to the world, as if she had been erased or forgotten. The only thing she had with her, the nurse said, was a small necklace, its chain worn thin, with a tiny heart-shaped pendant dangling from it. She placed the pendant in his palm for safekeeping, and Alexander studied it under the harsh fluorescent lights. The metal was scratched, dull with age, yet it carried a quiet beauty that spoke of memory, perhaps of love, perhaps of loss. His fingers closed around it instinctively, as though holding on to the last fragment of her identity, and something inside him stirred again, deeper this time. He returned the pendant carefully, his voice low. Keep it safe for her. The nurse nodded and reassured him that she was now stable, though weak, and would need rest and proper nourishment to recover fully. Relief washed through Alexander, but it was a relief tangled with sorrow, for the image of her fragile state replayed in his mind, refusing to let go. He ran a hand through his hair. unsettled by the depth of his emotions, for this girl was a stranger. Yet his heart reacted as though she were something more. The nurse expected him to leave, but Alexander shook his head. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was so vulnerable. "Put all her expenses on my account," he said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. The nurse blinked, surprised at his generosity, then nodded with quiet respect. As she walked away, Alexander remained standing in the corridor, his tall frame tense, his eyes fixed on the closed door behind which the girl rested. He imagined her waking, up alone, confused, frightened, with no one by her side, and the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He lowered himself into a chair once more, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly together as though in silent prayer, though he had never been a man of faith. The hospital around him moved on. Stretchers wheeled by, doctors gave orders, families wept or rejoiced. But Alexander's world had narrowed to a single room, a single girl. Hours passed in quiet anticipation, each moment deepening the strange connection he felt, a bond he couldn't explain, as though the universe had tied an invisible thread between his life and hers. For once, business calls and looming deals didn't claw at his attention. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, yet he ignored it all. His entire empire could have collapsed that night, and he wouldn't have noticed, because in this moment, wealth meant nothing. What mattered was the girl lying unconscious beyond that door, the girl with no name, no past he knew of, and only a worn-out necklace to her name. Alexander leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, and realized he was feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Concern, not born of obligation, but of pure, unselfish care. It frightened him and comforted him all at once, a contradiction he couldn't resolve. Slowly, his restless pacing gave way to stillness, his heart quieting as he made a silent promise to himself. Whoever she was, whatever her story, he would not let her face it alone. He would stay, not out of pity, but out of a strange certainty that this moment was meant to happen, that this girl was meant to cross his path. The red light above the door flickered once more, and Alexander's eyes softened. A man who had everything yet felt he had found something far greater, though he did not yet understand what it was. The quiet hum of machines filled the hospital room as Alexander sat by the bedside, his tall frame leaning slightly forward, eyes fixed on the fragile figure lying under the thin white sheets. Hours had slipped away, and the night had turned to dawn, streaks of pale sunlight sneaking through the blinds to soften the cold sterility of the room. His gaze sharpened suddenly when he noticed movement. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted slightly, and a faint whisper escaped her, as though pulled from the depths of silence. Slowly, with visible effort, the girl's eyes opened, revealing a pair of soft yet weary eyes that carried stories too heavy for someone so young. Alexander felt a tension release in his chest he hadn't even realized he was holding, and before he could speak, her trembling voice broke the stillness. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile but laced with sincerity that pierced straight into his guarded heart. He leaned closer, careful not to startle her, and in that quiet moment, she gave him her name. "Isabella," she said softly, almost as though saying it reminded her of who she was after being lost for too long. The syllables lingered in the air, delicate yet powerful, and Alexander repeated it in his mind, committing it to memory as though it was something precious. Isabella's gaze drifted downward, her fingers twisting slightly in the blanket, shame flickering across her features as she spoke again. Words spilled slowly, weighted with the burden of her past, and Alexander listened without interruption. She told him how her parents had passed away in an accident years ago, leaving her alone in a world that seemed too vast and cruel for someone with no one to lean on. She described long nights working in diners, cleaning offices, taking whatever job she could just to afford a bed to sleep in and food to survive, yet even then, hunger often followed her like a shadow. As she spoke, her voice wavered, but there was no self-pity, only a quiet strength that surprised him. Each sentence painted a picture of survival against odds that would have broken most people. Yet here she was, still breathing, still fighting, even if she had collapsed in the streets the night before. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest as he listened, emotions he had long buried stirring uneasily. He was a man who had built an empire, who had conquered boardrooms and signed deals worth millions, but in that moment, he felt smaller than the girl before him, for she had endured pain that no fortune could shield against. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she confessed how loneliness had been her constant companion, how she often sat in silence at night, wishing for someone, anyone, who cared whether she lived another day. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, yet her expression held resilience, as though she had long accepted the weight of her suffering and carried it without complaint. Alexander's throat grew tight, his jaw set, his usual composure slipping as he absorbed every word. He wanted to speak, to comfort her, but instead he remained silent, realizing that listening was the most valuable gift he could offer. For years, he had been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, investors, employees, partners, but here sat a girl who wanted nothing, who simply revealed her truth with raw honesty. It disarmed him in a way nothing else ever had. His gaze softened as he studied her, not as a CEO analyzing a person, but as a man humbled by another's courage. Her clothes were worn, her face pale from hardship. Yet in her eyes he saw a fire, a strength forged through pain. It struck him with quiet force, and admiration bloomed in his chest, mingled with sorrow. He realized then that while he had everything, wealth, power, status, he had never known this kind of strength, the kind that came not from resources, but from sheer will to keep going when the world offered nothing. The silence between them grew heavy, but not uncomfortable, rather filled with an unspoken understanding that bridged the gulf between their very different worlds. Isabella looked at him, perhaps expecting judgment or pity, but she found neither. Instead, she saw a man watching her as though she mattered, as though her story was worth hearing, and it made her chest ache with unfamiliar warmth. Alexander shifted slightly in his chair, his hands resting on his knees, his heart caught between the life he knew and the new reality she was pulling him toward. He had always believed power lay in money, yet here, in the presence of a fragile girl with nothing but her name and a past filled with pain, he realized true strength was something else entirely. And as Isabella's voice grew quiet, exhaustion pulling at her again, Alexander sat still, his chest tight with emotions he hadn't felt in years, unsure of what this connection meant, but certain it was unlike anything he had ever known. The days that followed carried a rhythm Alexander had never experienced before, a rhythm not dictated by boardroom schedules or endless business calls, but by quiet visits to a hospital room where a fragile girl was finding her strength again. At first he told himself he was there simply out of duty, that it was his responsibility after being the one who had carried her in, but each day he stayed longer than intended. Each day he found excuses to return sooner than expected. What began as short check-ins stretched into hours of conversation, and what surprised him most was how easily the walls he had built around himself began to crack. Isabella, though recovering, greeted him with a smile that carried more warmth than all the polished greetings he received in his corporate world. She asked him questions no one else dared to ask, about his childhood, about what he dreamed of before wealth consumed his life, and he found himself answering honestly, almost forgetting he was Alexander Reed, the man known for power and control. Their conversations flowed like rivers winding through bows, the sorrow and joy sometimes heavy with confessions, sometimes light with laughter that echoed in the sterile room and softened its harshness. There were moments when silence filled the air, yet it was not empty. It was comforting, a silence where two souls could simply exist without needing to impress or pretend. Alexander began to notice the little things about her, the way her eyes brightened when she spoke about simple joys like sunsets or the smell of rain, the way her voice softened when she described her hopes, fragile yet unbroken, as if clinging to dreams no hardship could steal. Despite everything she had endured, Isabella carried a spark of hope in her heart that radiated in every word, and it humbled him. He, who had more than enough, had forgotten what it meant to dream, yet here was a girl with nothing teaching him that life was not about possessions, but about moments that stirred the soul. Sometimes tears slipped from her eyes when memories of her past pressed too heavily, and Alexander found himself reaching out, not with solutions or money, but with simple presence, sitting beside her in silence until her breathing steadied again. Other times her laughter filled the room, light and melodic, and he caught himself smiling in ways he hadn't in years. She had nothing to offer in material wealth, yet she gave him everything he hadn't realized he needed: connection, authenticity, warmth. Alexander, who had always prided himself on being untouchable, began to feel alive in ways he couldn't explain, his heart lighter each time he stepped into that room. Isabella often teased him gently about his serious demeanor, coaxing laughter from him until he shook his head in disbelief at how easily she could undo years of stoic control. She spoke of kindness as though it were a currency more valuable than gold, reminding him that true wealth was not measured by numbers in an account but by the love one shared, the compassion one gave. Slowly, he found himself looking forward to each day, not for the deals he would close, but for the hours he would spend seated by her side, listening, learning, rediscovering parts of himself he had long buried. Nurses began to notice the transformation in him, the way the powerful CEO softened whenever he entered her room, the way his stern features relaxed at the sight of her smile. Even he noticed it, how different he felt, how alive. It startled him sometimes, how much this girl with nothing had given him without even trying. He no longer saw her as the unconscious figure he had carried in one desperate night. He saw her as Isabella, a soul whose resilience and warmth illuminated corners of his life he hadn't realized were dark. And as the days turned into weeks, Alexander began to understand that this bond they were weaving was not built on obligation or circumstance, but on something far deeper, something priceless. A reminder that even a man who had everything could discover he had been missing the most important thing of all: love, disguised as simple human warmth. The bond between Alexander and Isabella had grown so naturally that he rarely questioned why he felt such a deep pull toward her. But one evening, as the sun sank low and painted the streets in shades of gold and amber, fate unveiled a truth he never imagined. He had offered to help Isabella collect her few belongings from an old shelter she sometimes returned to, a place where she had spent countless nights enduring loneliness and hardship. As he carefully lifted a worn bag from under her small cot, something slipped out and caught his eye. It was an old photograph, edges frayed, its colors faded with time, yet the image upon it was unmistakable. His hands trembled as he picked it up, and his breath caught in his chest, for staring back at him from the photograph was the familiar face of the man who had once been his guiding light, his late mentor, Richard Hale, the very person who had shaped him into the man he had become. His pulse quickened, confusion storming inside him as he turned toward Isabella, his eyes demanding answers. She froze, her gaze falling on the photo in his hand, and slowly, tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could speak. With a trembling voice, she whispered the words that shattered and remade his world in the same instant. Richard Hale was her father. Alexander staggered back, the photograph trembling in his grasp, his mind racing through memories of the man who had been more than a mentor. He had been family, a father figure in every sense but name. He remembered the wisdom, the late-night conversations, the sacrifices his mentor had made to guide him, and now, standing before him, was the daughter he never knew existed. Isabella's voice cracked as she explained how tragedy had torn her world apart, how the loss of her father had left her adrift and alone, stripped of stability, comfort, and love. She had carried that single photograph like a lifeline, a reminder of the man who once held her hand and told her she would never be alone. Her eyes, wet with sorrow, searched Alexander's face, fearful of his reaction, terrified that this revelation would push him away. But Alexander's heart thundered with an overwhelming mix of emotions: shock, grief, wonder, and something indescribably profound. He had always carried guilt over not being able to give back enough to the man who had given him everything. And now here was Isabella, the living legacy of that very man, standing in front of him, fragile yet resilient. His voice faltered as he asked why she had never said anything before, and she admitted that she hadn't known who Alexander truly was until recently, and even then she feared he would see her differently, that he would see her as a burden tied to his past. But Alexander shook his head, his throat too tight for words, as the weight of destiny settled on his shoulders. The girl he had rescued by chance, the girl who had brought life and warmth back into his hollow world, was not just a stranger. She was family in the truest, most unexpected sense. As the truth sank in, memories of his mentor's unwavering kindness echoed through his mind, and he realized that this encounter was no accident. It was as if fate itself had woven their paths together, giving him one last chance to honor the man who had meant so much to him. Isabella wept openly now, her body trembling with the release of secrets she had carried for far too long, and Alexander, for the first time in years, felt his own tears fall freely. He reached out, pulling her gently into his arms, holding her as though he were holding a piece of his mentor, a fragment of the love and guidance that had shaped his own life. In that embrace, pain and revelation mingled, binding them not only through shared sorrow, but through an unbreakable bond forged by destiny. Alexander knew in his heart that the photograph had not fallen by chance. It was the universe's way of reminding him that wealth and power meant nothing compared to the legacy of love and the responsibility of family. What had begun as an unexpected encounter on a lonely night had now revealed itself as something far greater, a reunion written in the stars, a truth that would forever change the way he saw Isabella, his mentor, and even himself. Alexander stood there in the dimly lit shelter, his arms wrapped around Isabella, the truth of their connection still echoing in his chest like a thunderclap. His life, once filled with empty boardrooms, hollow victories, and nights spent staring at the ceiling in silence, suddenly carried a weight that was both heavy and healing. For years he had believed his success was measured by numbers, contracts, and power. But in that moment he realized it meant nothing compared to the fragile, trembling girl who was now family. As they walked out into the cool night air together, Alexander felt the world shift beneath his feet, as if fate itself had rewritten his story. He made a silent vow then and there, not as a businessman making a deal, but as a man who finally understood love, loyalty, and legacy. He would protect Isabella with every fiber of his being, shield her from the loneliness she had endured, and honor the memory of the man who had given him a chance when he had nothing. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander's presence in Isabella's life became more than just an act of kindness. It became a promise lived every day. He ensured she had a safe place to call home, filling it not with luxury, but with warmth, laughter, and the kind of small, precious moments that money could never buy. They cooked simple meals together, shared late-night conversations that stretched into dawn, and sometimes just sat in silence, knowing that their bond required no words. Isabella, once fragile and unsure, began to bloom like a flower, long deprived of sunlight, her hope rekindled by the certainty that she was no longer alone. Alexander, on the other hand, discovered a side of himself he had buried beneath years of ambition, a softness, a joy in giving without expecting, a peace in simply being present. In Isabella's smile, he saw a reflection of his mentor's wisdom, and in her laughter, he found the music that had been missing from his heart. As seasons changed, so did they. The lonely CEO was no longer a man bound by boardrooms and contracts. He was a guardian, a companion, a brother and protector rolled into one. Isabella, once a girl wandering in the shadows of despair, now walked in the light, her steps steady, her heart open, her spirit unbroken. Together they discovered that family was not always built by blood alone, but by choices, by sacrifices, by love that asked for nothing in return. And so, Alexander's life found a new rhythm, no longer haunted by empty victories, but filled with purpose and belonging. He knew his mentor would have been proud, not of his wealth or empire, but of the man he had finally become. The bond between him and Isabella grew into something unshakable, stronger than fortune, deeper than power. He had once thought of himself as a solitary king, ruling over a hollow empire, but with Isabella by his side, he was simply a man who had found the missing piece of his soul. As they stood together at the edge of a sunrise one morning, the light spilling over the horizon, Alexander smiled for the first time in years. Not the rehearsed smile of a CEO, but the genuine smile of a man who finally understood the meaning of life. Isabella slipped her hand into his, and in that simple gesture lay everything he had ever searched for: trust, belonging, love, and hope. From that day forward, they were no longer two lost souls colliding by chance, but a family bound by destiny. Alexander Reed, once the lonely millionaire, had found his true fortune not in riches, but in the fragile girl he had saved on a quiet street, who turned out to be the very heart he never knew he was missing. Their story, born out of pain and chance, became a new beginning, a life filled with purpose, love, and a bond that even time itself could never break.